The latest from 7 News with Michael Usher.
Good evening and welcome to the latest on the China Eastern plane crash. Flight MU 5735 departed Kunming Airport 1:15 p.m. on the 21st of March. It was headed to Guangzhou International Airport, but around 2:20 p.m. the jetliner rapidly nosedived from 29,000 feet to about 7,000 feet. It briefly levelled out again before plummeting to the ground. Officials are still trying to piece together what happened to the jetliner as desperately family members search for answers. 132 people were on board. None survived. Tonight, we're live to our reporter to get the latest updates after the discovery of the plane's black box and learn more about the pilots who are in the cockpit. We'll also speak with aviation and forensic experts to provide more insight into what investigators are looking for. So let's go to Hong Kong now for more from our correspondent Richard Kimber. Richard, good evening to you. So has the discovery of a black box provided any more clues, and what's the very latest?
That's right. There's just a news conference going on right now with more details of this rescue effort. The first of two black boxes, these data recorders on the plane, has now been discovered. This is the cockpit voice recording device. It's probably the less vital of the two black boxes. The other one that has yet to be found includes all of the flight data. But this first cockpit voice recorder is being analysed now by teams in Beijing. When it was found, it was pretty battered, and there are concerns that the internal memory unit of that device may also be damaged, which may potentially delay any reports of findings from that unit. But this is particularly important because there have also been released just in the last few minutes voice recordings from air traffic control in Guangzhou and from other airlines that were called in to try to help contact this jetliner as it appeared to be in trouble. Those voice recordings have really shown how desperate the situation was as this plane started descending, because as all of these pilots and the air traffic controllers tried to make contact with this plane, they simply couldn't get through, and there was no reply from anybody on board, further confusing this investigation and again bring more questions than answers with regards to what exactly was happening on board. So this cockpit voice recorder could actually be a more vital clue than it often is in investigations to leading us to some answers as to what was going on.
And Richard, we're learning more about the pilots on the flight, I understand?
That's right. There's been official details released about them too. The captain of the plane had more than 6,000 hours of flying experience. The first co-pilot, actually one of the most experienced pilots in China with more than 30 years aviation experience. He had more than 30,000 hours of flying. All three pilots are said to have had exemplary safety records, and one local newspaper, somewhat dispelling concerns about perhaps their mental health, has said that all three were known to be family men with a happy family environment. There's of course some concern because of the way that this plane crashed that it may have been a deliberate act by the part of pilots. Still no real answers on that, but because we now know a little more about who these men were, there's of course more reporting and investigations going into their own personal lives too. But still many more questions than answers with regards to the way that this plane behaved because of the irregular way in which it crashed. Again, this slowly trickle of information coming out from this investigation, but with the weather, as you can probably tell behind me here in Hong Kong, the same weather pattern is also affecting the search effort in Guangzhou, just across the border in the Chinese mainland, really hampering this rescue effort, with hundreds of workers having to adopt a very stop-start manner to try to get through this very densely vegetated hillside where the plane came down.
Now, Richard, it was a Boeing made in America, so how's China working with the United States investigators on the disaster?
Well, China has been somewhat proactive in enacting a piece of legislation that allows international involvement in this according to international law with regards to aviation. So there will be US representatives from the US regulators taking part in this, and Boeing has said from the start that it wants to be as involved as possible. Now, analysts say that they are optimistic of this being a transparent investigation. They say it's really in China's interests for that to be the case, not least for the reputation of the Chinese aviation industry, which has a fairly reliable safety record, but also because China operates so many of these Boeing jets. It operates more of these 737-800 jets than any other country in the world. And so it really is in China's aviation interests to get to the bottom of this crash, because China Eastern Airlines, the airline at the center of this crash, has grounded all of those 737-800s since this crash happened. And that's led to thousands of flight cancellations across the Chinese mainland. So it's causing massive transport disruption there. So certainly in the interests of the Chinese authorities to find out exactly what happened.
All right, Richard Kimber there with the very latest from Hong Kong. Thank you for that. Now, without communications with the crew before the crash, it's a mystery so far to determine exactly what happened. Let's go now to aviation expert and former airline pilot Keith Tonkin now. Keith, good to have you on our show tonight. Firstly, for our audience now, you used to fly the 737-800 aircraft in your time at Qantas. They're a trusted model for airlines around the world. What's your take on what's happened here?
Thanks, Michael. Well, my take is it's very unusual and quite disturbing to see the footage on the television or wherever else you can get a view of what happened and try to make sense of it, which is what we would all do in these circumstances. And the lack of information that is available to us really leaves a lot of questions and not very many answers.
Yeah. Look, this is a trusted aircraft, there's no doubt about that. I mean, there were problems with the MAX a few years ago, but this is different in model and make. But from what you've seen, and as we showed in our graphic at the beginning here, the way it descends sharply, appears to level out, descends again, and as we've just heard from the reporter just before you, the cockpit recordings have been released where there's frantic efforts to talk to the pilot, but long periods of silence after that. That pattern, have you seen that? Has that happened in previous crashes anywhere in the world?
It probably has happened. It's quite unusual, and it seems like there's some sort of struggle to control the aircraft. There's obviously been some reason to descend quickly in the first place, and then the levelling out and the initial small climb and then the rapid descent afterwards is really quite unusual. Doesn't explain anything to us. There may have been some sort of initiating problem, but we don't know what that was. And the ultimate conclusion after levelling out and then descending at such steep rates and such high speeds really says that there was a loss of control in the end.
Does that slight levelling out indicate to you, you mentioned the word struggle, that they were able to regain control at some point? Would that have been the cause of the pilots, or would something be electronic or automatic on board that would have helped that?
It's hard to tell. It feels as though they've made a decision, or there's been some reason to descend, and then in the course of levelling out there may have been some other issue that was not dealt with, so that ultimately the control was lost. Whether that was due to the pilots or the aircraft systems, it's very unlikely.
I think the thing, Keith, that goes through my mind is that sort of rapid descent, I mean, there would have been a fair amount of chaos on board. I mean, how would the pilots have been coping with the pressures of that very rapid descent, just physically on themselves as they descend in that pattern? And I'm guessing there's some sort of training if something catastrophic happens, but how do you handle that?
Absolutely. It's commonly practiced. It's one of the things you practice regularly in the event of some sort of rapid depressurisation of the aircraft. So it's one of those things it's allowed for. There are systems and procedures in place to conduct that activity. It's practiced in the simulator so that if it does eventuate in the real world, then you're prepared for it. It's something that you wouldn't do normally, and so possibly in the real world there may be some sort of confusion, but it seems as though that some level of control was retained after the initial descent. What happened after that is really to be determined.
We've heard that press conference underway in mainland China, in fact right now as we speak, but they've got some of the black box recordings. It was in a pretty bad state. How long does that process normally take to analyse that sort of data?
Well, if the black box is intact, it can be days or weeks, but if it's quite badly damaged, which it may in this case be, it might take much longer than that. And obviously there'll be a lot of effort put towards trying to get that information as soon as we can. The
crew seemed very experienced, as we've been hearing. The captain had thousands of hours flying experience. I think the first co-pilot had 30 years in the industry, as our correspondent just said. What does that indicate to you? Obviously, you know, fear that there might have been some sort of problem with the humans in the cockpit, but does it more point toward a large mechanical failure if you had that amount of experience in the cockpit?
Well, it is too early to tell. There's a lot of experience, obviously, if those reports are correct, and someone who's flown the aeroplane for that many years will be very experienced and expect to have seen lots of different circumstances where you might be out of your comfort zone, and that people like that, having practiced and seen so many things, should be able to accommodate something out of the ordinary. So it's very difficult to understand.
It is indeed, and look, those conditions there, as we're seeing on the screen now, are so difficult to get to that crash site and just retrieve as much evidence as they can. But you, among many, will be very curious to see exactly what happened here, no doubt. Keith Tonkin, very good to have you with us tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Investigators are going through a painstaking process at the crash site, making it worse. The rain, some bad weather. Let's bring in forensics expert Greg Kelly, who's in Sydney for us tonight. Greg, you've got a lot of expertise in pulling evidence out of severe fire situations, and you've seen things incinerated. Now, debris, though, is scattered across both sides of the mountain where the plane came down. What are the teams going to be looking for?
I think they would normally, in this sort of situation, Michael, divide up into a number of groups, the engineering teams as well as teams that would be primarily responsible for the identification in such a tragic loss of either individuals or, unfortunately, body parts, and all that has to be identified. They'd be looking at what's left of the plane and what's scattered in regard to the overall scene. It'd be a very, very large scene, but then they'll break up with engineering teams. I'd expect that probably to have representatives of the manufacturers and the airline themselves, along with air safety officials that will be coordinating that examination, recording the evidence, and at times we even have to set up temporary morgues to process what has to be done and move the machinery to one side, or even put roping off and guards around it so that you can go back and lift it out if you can get to it.
How difficult is it to pull evidence out of a scene like this? I understand you've covered some plane crashes, you've got an intense catastrophic event happening in the crash, but also all of that fuel, fire, explosions. It must be a disaster to get to and try and pull evidence out of.
It really has. The plane crashes I've done, fortunately, have not been at jet level, but they certainly have been at small aircraft with people that have been on board. And typically, as you'd imagine, with fire, it's quite catastrophic and very, very difficult work. And at the same time, working with air safety investigators, looking at what the mechanical remains are, identifying the various parts, which is why you need that team of effect. I'm not an expert in everything for sure, and no one really is. They have to bring this team together that can identify parts and see what reference it has into the scene that's being examined, and putting it to one side.
Because like going to any scene where there's been a catastrophic explosion or fire that you're well used to, it only takes a microscopic bit of evidence, doesn't it, to hopefully find what went wrong?
Yes, it does. And obviously you're starting from the extremities of the larger things, looking for what's missing. And then as you get down into that painstaking work, often in these sort of scenes, we can be down on our knees with a brickies trowel, just scraping through that, using sieves, trying to find out what small componentry or other parts you might identify, rather than just using, as we've seen in some of the news reports, excavators. And that might be simply trying to get down to the layers that the aircraft might have bedded into the side of the mountain.
Yeah. Are we trained for this sort of thing in Australia, if a plane like that came down in those circumstances?
Yes, when I was in police forensics, it was quite common to have a coordinated response from our hospital staff, from the airlines, from the airports, and everyone knows their role, which includes police rescue. So should there be an emergency, then we will go about it, and everyone knows what their role is and how to coordinate that. So it is something that's done. They stage exercises so that people can practice what has to be done if the real event happens. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of that in Australia.
What about in a circumstance like this, and we've only seen that bit of vision where it looks like it nosedived from a great height and it's hit the ground, it's virtually disintegrated on impact. There's not a lot of evidence of big bits of wreckage there either. How difficult does that make it? And as we're seeing here, the conditions are just atrocious as well to try and get in there.
Obviously, the terrain, the angle that the aircraft has hit at will all impact on how you go about the investigation, what resources have to be drawn in, even the topography, and what sort of equipment can you get in there. Will they have to airlift the excavation equipment in to then start searching around the perimeter for what should be there? And if they then have to dig into the terrain to try and see what might be buried because of the velocity and the speed, or speed to velocity is the same thing, but to look at how far they're going to have to go to try and pick it up.
Yeah, I'm guessing you don't envy their task at the moment. It's going to be a difficult one, isn't it, Greg?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. All right, Greg Kelly, forensic expert, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Michael.
And that's the latest on the China air crash investigation. Thank you for your company. I'm Michael Usher.